Welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Turn the Page, the official podcast of Syosset Public Library. I'm Jen, your co-host for today, or rather one of your co-hosts, because today I am also here with
Melissa. Hi.
And Melissa and I are here with the author of a really exciting new cookbook inspired by a fandom of which we are both members.
That's why I'm wearing my shirt.
Yeah. For those who are only listening, we have a Stephen King shirt represented here. So let's talk to our author. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book?
Of course. Thank you for having me. My name's Theresa Carle-Sanders, and I am the author of Castle Rock Kitchen, which is wicked good recipes from the world of Stephen King.
Excellent. Do you want to start us off, Melissa?
Sure. So my first probably major question is, you got Stephen King to write the introduction, and obviously you got him to sign off on the rights to these recipes. Yeah. How did you get in contact? Like, I can't imagine you just called him up and were like, "Hey, Stephen!" Like,
"Hey, Steve."
Yeah.
Baby. No. I have a really good agent, Susan, who give her 2 floors on an elevator and she'll talk you into anything, quite seriously, in a good way. And I don't know, I never did ask her. She probably pulled a personal favor to get his agent, Chuck Farrell's number. Chuck is dead now, so he's been there's someone else agenting for Stephen, but and she did it. I can still remember the call. She was calling. She lives in LA, and I lived at the time on a tiny island on the west coast of Canada. And she called me in traffic on speakerphone and said he said yes, and that was January 21st, 2020. Wow. No, yes, 2020. Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so I read for the pandemic. I had already read, let's say, 25 to 30 novels to do the proposal. But then after that, the pandemic hit almost right after that. So I was in a deep, dark Stephen King well for a long time on a very small island.
That sounds magical. It was out of a Stephen King book.
It does, like one of the meta ones, you know, like that's so interesting.
It was the perfect atmosphere. Yeah,
it's like, what a way to really immerse yourself in his world, you know, which must have been like a really helpful thing in order to write this book. That does kind of lead to one of my questions, which is so this is your second sort of like fandom inspired cookbook, is that right? Or is there
It's my third. So
I'm sorry.
Outlander, I have 2 Outlander Kitchen.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Number 1 and number 2.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so Castle Rock Kitchen is number 3.
Excellent. Yeah, I'm curious about whether these were these fandoms that you already belonged to, and like in addition to that, like what was your kind of research process for either familiarizing yourself or refamiliarizing yourself?
Yeah, I was a big fan of Diana Gabaldon's from let's say 2003 on, and I had the idea for a recipe from Voyager, which is the 3rd book in the series, in 2009. And I sort of had it in the woods with walking with the dog on this tiny island. And it's pigeon rolls with truffle was the very first recipe I ever did. And Diana got back to me the next day and said, "Wow, what a weird idea. Why don't you do it?" And so we did it, and she put it on her social media. And so it got a lot of attention. And then for the next, 5-6 years, I had a blog, and I blogged Outlander food. And along the way, there was a TV show. And from the TV show, we went from millions of strange time travel fans to tens of millions. And at that point, the publishers decided I'd been asking for years to write a cookbook. But it was with the TV show that they said yes. And then I wrote the second Outlander Kitchen cookbook it came out actually during the pandemic, 2020. And it sold very well, I think, just because everybody was at home baking and trying to pretend they were in the 18th century in some Outlander fans anyway. And I've been a fan of Stephen King's pretty much my whole adult life as well. When I married my husband, he's a big horror fan. And so I did read all the Stephen King ones, a lot of his early works. But when we started this project, I started in the order they were published. And so I went from Carrie all the way through to Elevation. I skipped the Dark Tower series for a certain reason at that time, because that's tens of thousands of pages. And from there, from Carrie, at the beginning, it was a bit worrying. There was a root beer and a hamburger, and that's all there is in the entire novel. And I had thought I'd been so clever, and I was like, oh, what a great idea. Tens of millions of fans. He's got like 60, he's got dozens of books. So I've got all this material to draw from. And some pretty intense fans. Intense fans help a lot to sell things like this. And it got better, thank God. Salem's Lot was the next one, and there was a nice bolognese, nice spaghetti sounding spaghetti sauce in that. So I did that. And then Elevation, there's a gourmet Mexican restaurant. So there's all these delicious Mexican food that's described. It's really ideal, actually.
So you were a fan of Stephen King before you actually started the research for this. And I know you said you read it in order for the research, but what was the first book you ever read by him, and what is your favorite book by him?
That's a good question. The first book I ever read was The Shining. And that was because my best friend in the whole world, we've been friends since we were 5 years old, but she had seen The Shining when she was too young, and we were having a sleepover, and she scared the bejesus out of me, chasing me around the house with red rum. Anyway, it's a long story. And then I was quite damaged by that, to be honest. I was quite a timid child. And so when I was about 18, I decided I was going to read The Shining and get over this hiccup that I had. And I've still never watched the movie. I don't really know if I want to be honest. I've seen enough clips to know that I'll just be like this the whole time. And then my favorite Stephen King, I have a few. I love 11/22/63.
One of my favorites.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah,
favorites.
yeah. It's got a beautiful love story in it, and I'm obviously got a time travel thing. And then I like the other one I really like is Needful Things, and that's just because it's so deliciously evil. It's just so evil. There is no redeeming quality about really any of those people.
Yes.
And normally I would be really put off by that many unlikable characters, but it's just Stephen King's magical way of writing and bringing them alive.
I think that's amazing because you just talked about like my two absolute favorite books by him. And people always say, I'm looking for a nice long read, and I'll say 11/22/63. And they're like, but Stephen King is scary. And I'm like, no, this is not a scary book. It's a
exactly.
love story.
Yeah,
And it's
exactly.
funny 'cause you happened upon Stephen King accidentally, and so did I. I accidentally read his book for an 8th grade summer reading course, and didn't understand half the book.
Yeah.
Wrote like a 2-page paper on it and ended up getting an A. But the teacher had to pull me aside and was like, Melissa, you read the wrong book. And I was like, oh my goodness. And I just became a fan ever since.
Nice.
That's an excellent first book story. That's a great book.
Yeah. Oh, that's fun. Mine was completely inappropriate at the time. I think I was like 10 years old, and it was Gerald's Game,
Oh my
which
goodness.
was oh my gosh, like
All have the same face.
yeah, like trauma, like just
That's quite funny. Yeah.
oh gosh. So something I'm curious about, something I'm super interested in is how well researched this is. And part of that is you being a fan and having read his stuff and then re-immerse yourself. But part of it is also I was so impressed by the section of staples, and they're all sort of Maine, local products and stuff that it feels very authentic and very real for recreating the kind of Maine atmosphere.
Exactly.
And what was your research like for that?
It was difficult because it was the pandemic, and I lived on a small island with 2,500 other people, and I couldn't get off that island for the first 6 months. We weren't, unless there was an emergency, we couldn't leave the island. But Maine has the most incredible archive of every agricultural pamphlet, every fishing, all the seafood, all that stuff, like from the 50s, the beautiful mid-century stuff is all in very easy to find on Google. And I found that. So I used a lot of that. I had a lot of books from Maine. Old Marjorie Standish is an old Maine newspaper columnist that used to have a recipe every week in Portland. And I read her books again from the 60s, early 70s. So some of it is really plain, standard, boiled down, like boiled fish and milk. I mean, it's awful sounding. Like scallops baked in milk. Oh my God, how to ruin scallops in less than 10 minutes. But there's always things you can take from that, right? And I also took a bit of her voice. She was very straightforward and plain speaker. And I did speak to Stephen King on the telephone for 30 minutes. And he's a really generous, lovely man. And he told me stories about his mom's cooking, Tabitha's cooking, and then also what he likes to eat. Tabitha can't taste anymore because she's lost her sense of smell. So she doesn't really have any interest in cooking. So he cooks for himself, which you see on Twitter when he tells you how to cook salmon in a microwave. I don't know if you saw that, but it was quite funny. I was just like, just put salt on it. Just put salt on it. At least it. Anyway. And I talked to him and he told me that Dolores Claiborne was the most Maine character he'd ever written. And so I went and read that again. And then I flipped back to the beginning of the book and I read it again. And if you've ever read it, it's probably the most difficult of his books to get through. I find it so anyway, just because it's all in the first person and there's no punctuation, really. And that kind of thing really bugs me. But anyway, she was a great model for a voice. And we were looking for an in-world voice, like you say, to keep all the pantry ingredients, all the staples, and then put one more layer and have a character from a novel narrate the cookbook, which is something I've never done before. And it scared the pants off of me. So Stephen King sort of gave me that help by picking that voice, by telling me to go to Dolores Claiborne, but I didn't want to choose a character that already had a voice, because then I would have to copy Stephen King, which is really my ultimate nightmare. I mean, that would keep me up for weeks at night. And so I found this little gem of a woman named Mrs. Garrity. We don't even know her first name. And it's from The Long Walk. And it's the first story he ever wrote. So he wrote it when he was 19, but it was published as a Bachman book. And we meet Mrs. Garrity at the beginning. And I think she has 5 words to say. And she hands her son some hermit cookies. So that's where that whole thing was born. I was like, oh, hermits. And then about 3 pages later, I skimmed back on my Kindle and said, oh, she's going to work. She's going to work because she's lived in Maine her whole life. She's got her whole family lives in Maine. She's not going anywhere because it's a pretty dystopian world. I don't want to spoil the end, but she has she lives in a mean time with unlimited means because of what her son did in The Long Walk. And so she can buy things and make recipes and do things that nobody else in her world would be able to do, right? I mean, everybody there is scrounging, but she's got money, so she can. And it was just fun.
I love that. Because that was one of my questions. I'm like, this random character when there's just so many people. I love that you gave her the voice instead. I love that. It's like her own little side piece.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. And I think Stephen King thought it was a bit weird. I kept saying, well, I've chosen Mrs. Garrity, and there would be silence. And he'd be like, well, let's talk about Dolores Claiborne again then. Okay. But I couldn't put it into words at the time, but I could never write like Dolores Claiborne. And there's a few other, I had a few other choices, I guess. But like Dick Halloran is a great cook, but that's not really my voice, is it? So yeah, there's, and because The Dark Tower and all that, there's a great cook in The Dark Tower that would make a great narrator. But these stories all take place in Maine. So there are some books that have been left behind.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I like that because Stephen King, all of his books tie into or all his Castle Rock books kind of tie into each other, and I love the fact that a lot of your recipes kind of tie into each other. The strawberry shortcake, it bakes like the biscuits, or the sauce from one recipe can be used on another recipe. Did you do that on purpose to kind of tie them all in as a Stephen King book would be, or is that just how you do a recipe?
It seems to happen. It happened in Outlander Kitchen too, and it makes for a really nice smooth thing because I can see people flipping back and forth between the notes and stuff, which is really cool, right? It means you're really engaged in reading. And editors don't like it. They're like, oh, Theresa, it's such a pain in the ass. And I'm like, no, but you got to have the stuffing on the blue plate special, but you got to have stuffings anyway. So it happens by accident, but I think it's because there's themes, like we're in Maine all the time, right? We've ignored all his other books, so we're only ever in Maine. So the same types of food come up. Same thing in Outlander. Bread and ale is mentioned, I can tell you, probably 6,000 times across 10 books. I've written them all down. At one point in my life, I've written them all down. And so you get themes going, right? And then you're like, oh, that sauce would work really well there. And in Maine, we're working with seafood, so you have to have tartar sauce, you have to have other things too, and they all go together.
I love that. I love tie into each other.
Yeah, that's very cool. So this is probably, I guess, like a general cookbook writing question more, rather than being specifically about cooking Stephen King stuff. But like, what is the process like for crafting an individual recipe? Like, do you have to cook it multiple times in order to land on, ingredients and ratios and stuff like that? Like, how much testing goes in before something is like finalized on the page?
Sometimes it can be once and there'll be a big yippee. Other times, usually with a really expensive ingredient, it takes sometimes 4, 5, 6 times. If I'm really there's always 2 or 3 recipes that are just a pain, and I don't know why. But once I get them, I am a trained cook, and I've been reading food magazines and Martha Stewart cookbooks since I was a little girl. And so when I write recipes, it's writing a recipe is really it's technical writing. So it's kind of like writing VCR instruction manuals, but one is a Toshiba, one's a Sony, and it can be really dry. But anyway, so then once I've got it to the point where I like it, and then I move on and I get them all done, then I send them off to my testers. And I've got 12 testers now that have been with me from book 1 of Outlander. I put a call out on the internet and I got 1,000 responses back, and I had to pick 10 people. And I picked 10 pretty great people. I would say they're all pretty, like, they could get money for testing recipes now. They know how to do it. They know how to give me the feedback. And what they're doing is checking, just in case I haven't put a tablespoon of salt instead of a teaspoon, or the temperature is wrong. Their oven is quite different from mine, and so it works differently. And that goes on for about 3 months. And then after that, I turn the manuscript into the editor.
Mm-hmm. That kind of technical writing can be really tricky, because in some cases you are trying to explicate a process that you have internalized so thoroughly. Yeah. Like some things that you sort of just do by muscle memory, you might not remember to kind of put in there for somebody who is like approaching a recipe time. So like that's also a really challenging part. Like, how do you explain your expertise to a beginner?
It's like
Mm-hmm.
It gets easier. I mean, there's only so many ways you can describe things now, and a lot of techniques get repeated over and over, so it is getting easier. But the one thing I have learned is I am not allowed, if I've made something, I'm not allowed to go to sleep until I've written it out, at least typed it out, because the next morning I'm like, I don't remember anything of what I did, because I've been doing this for 4 months, and they all become the same recipe after a while. And the only differentiation in my head sometimes is the book will pop up and I'll be like, oh yeah, okay, Under the Dome, okay. Cinnamon rolls, okay, here we go. Yeah.
And the craziest part is that not only are you writing down this recipe in this chemistry type scientific way, you're doing it from a voice not your own.
Oh yeah.
That's the
Mhm,
that's the
yeah.
craziest part. So, it's like
The recipe itself really is me. It's really me. Even if you go and look at the Outlander kitchen cookbooks where I'm not writing in world, it's just me. The recipes sound the same, but the head notes and the chapter introductions are all in Mrs. Garrity's Maine. She sounds a little bit like one of my grandmothers, and she sounds a little bit like my mom, and a little bit like me,
aw.
and a couple of grouchy people I've met along the way, and Dolores Claiborne.
They all tie into each other.
Yes, they do. Yeah.
How did you you read all the books and everything like that, as you were saying. But every once in a while you would mention a character in one of the headers on the side of the beginning of the recipe. And I would honestly have to go over to Google and be like, who is this character? how did you keep them all in line? How did you were you Google on the side?
Yes. So on top of all my main research, I also had there's a Stephen King wiki, right?
Yes.
And it's pretty accurate. I always tried to have at least 3 sources, or 2 if I couldn't find a third, just to make sure I was on the right track, because there is a lot of information out there, people just pontificating about and not really knowing. There's some really good Bev Vincent writes about Stephen King, like sort of as a biographer of him, and he's got some great notes. It's just the last 2 weeks were really hard. Like, I barricaded myself in my office and I was going through and making sure they were all right. And my editor was hauling me back a little bit just to make sure that we didn't make you do too much work, right? Like, you can't be too obscure with the mention, because then people get a bit turned off. So you kind of, most of the time, if it's the recipe, I'm talking about someone in the same book, right? I wasn't allowed to talk about other people, because I was like, but all this other stuff is going on over here on Castle Rock in another book, and I want to mention that. And she's like, no, Theresa, just slow it down. I got really into it. It was really fun. Yeah.
That is like a really fun kind of thing, like, because whenever I am looking for merchandise, is a very cynical term, but whenever I'm looking for an object or something to read that ties into like a fandom I love, or something like a TV show or a book, or
Like a spin-off?
or like the piece of like memorabilia or whatever it is. Like,
Memorabilia is a better one than merch.
yeah, for sure.
It's the really cynical one.
Yeah. I like when the thing itself could exist in world, like theoretically, like somebody could pick up Mrs. Garrity's writing and read it like in the world of Castle, like in this shared universe. Like, so I love like when, or if you get like a t-shirt from like a bar in a book, or like I just love
Totally.
something that a character could also pick up and use.
Yeah, she's a lot of fun. I think I really want to write another Stephen King cookbook, and he has given me the go ahead to research it, and we'll see how it goes. But I can't use her again. So, and I think it'll probably be a fantasy inspired. That's what I would like to do. So Dark Tower, and then all the stories that revolve around the Dark Tower. And there's a lot of those. Some of them even take place in Maine.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
That's really cool. It occurs to me that, like, because whenever we talk about like food and books, we're usually going to talk about like Tolkien, or like some kind of fantasy thing, or like where food is like the center. But it occurs to me that like food is a really important world building detail, not just for fantasy, but for like the world that we live in, or one that looks kind of like ours, but is a little off, like Stephen King's world, like food.
Exactly.
Like, food is such a just a lived in detail that can just render something very vivid or very real.
Yeah, and a lot of things happen when characters are around a table or they're eating. Big moments happen. Diana Gabaldon is really good for that, right? She'll have food going all the way around, and then someone will just explode in temper, and it makes a really great excerpt, because if you've read the book, you remember that scene for sure. And a lot of people say to me, I don't I don't know what you're talking about. When I started Outlander Kitchen, it was like 18th century Scottish food. What a good idea. Not. But I don't see the food in the books, they say. And then I just say that's because you're not looking for it. I now can't even read for pleasure without going, oh, fish pie. That, and the poor author's only got one book out, so it's going to be a while. But anyway, Stephen King's really good at dropping little things like that in to set the scene in his fantasy books, but also in Maine, like you say, there's just so many like Maine foods, and his forward is really great because it goes into what Maine food means to him, which is not necessarily exactly what the cookbook turned out to be, because you can't just fry fish and put vinegar on it and say, hey, here's a recipe. So it's a bit more complicated than that, but his simple approach to food is what shines in his books, I think.
And I think what helps too is the photos, which I would love to give a shout out to Jenny Bravo and her team, because she did an amazing job on those pictures too. So not only are you imagining in your head, you can see it right in front of you, and it's like, this is beautiful. Yeah, they're moody, they're mouth-watering, they're creepy, and some of them are a little bit disconcerting, and you're not quite sure why. I'm so lucky that she did it. And Chantal Lambeth was the stylist who did all the styling, and the two of them together are a rock star team. Have you worked with them before? No, never. Yeah. The art director at 10 Speed Press found them, and they just got so into it. They were so excited, and they got so into it, and their prop shopping expeditions were legendary. Oh, looking for all this creepy stuff. And there's a few Easter eggs in there, like there's the Cujo recipe has the Pinto car tag. Yes. There's a red balloon somewhere in the book. It's a bit hard to find. It's not too hard to find, but it's not right out in front of you. And there's a few other things that make it fun. Oh, I gotta go back and double check now. Yeah. We're really examine it now.
I love those things too, because they do reward multiple readings, and that is something that you're absolutely going to do with a cookbook, because if you like a recipe, you're going to keep going back to that. So it's kind of exciting that you could keep discovering something new,
And there's lots of people that have no intention of doing any cooking out of this book, right? But you can flip through it, and a lot of people say, it's a nice way to travel through the world rather than having going back into Outlander and reading all 10 books. You can just kind of flip through them at leisure and just enjoy yourself for an afternoon or whatever. Yeah,
I like that a lot. Well, I want to thank you so much for coming to talk to us. This has been so fun and so interesting. And, we really were both just huge fans of this book. And
I actually was lucky enough to eat the killer mac and cheese.
Oh,
yeah. Oh my God. It was delicious. It was so good. And not only can I wait to make that again. I have, a whole list of things I'm excited to make. So.
Oh, good. We'll take a picture next time. Take a picture, post it and tag me, and I'd love to look at it. I love doing that stuff.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you so much for listening. Listeners, you can get this book, Castle Rock Kitchen, at your favorite independent bookstore or library, perhaps.
Yes.
This has been Jen and Melissa in conversation with Theresa Carle-Sanders, and it is time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.